Father, we thank you for this night. We thank you that we can gather here together to share your word. Thank you for everything that you give us. Please be with us. Give us your Holy Spirit. Open our hearts. In Jesus' name I ask. Amen.
Amen. I've tried to keep up with the classes, but I've had lack of internet, so I'm a few days behind. And I think some of the classes some of the evening worships weren't recorded anyway. What I want to do over the next few days is go over the material that you've been doing since I've been away. So I want to have a quick review of Daniel 2 again, and then go into Revelation 17 as a way of revision, so that we know we're all on the same page. Part of it is so that I know that I'm in agreement with everybody. That's the main exercise, really, to make sure that I'm not out of sync with everybody else's understanding of what's going on. Got a couple of handouts. This one is really straightforward. It's just it's pioneer understanding of all the 10 nations of Europe. The first reference is from Josiah Litch. I've given a second reference from Apollos Hale, but I haven't given I haven't listed anything that he says, because it's identical to Josiah Litch's understanding. So I've just given a reference. It's in the second box from the bottom. It says 1843, Apollos Hale, the Second Advent Movement, page 84, paragraph 6. And he's going to give us all the same information that's in that table.
Sorry, I think we need at least every time 18.
18, sorry.
20. So
There's one more here.
just for future.
Okay.
You know how
I keep on underprinting. I keep on doing 15.
Is this the time they came into existence?
This is the time that the pioneers say that they came into existence. Yes. So all of those dates that you've got in that box are all of the dates that's on the chart.
Can you email these to me later today?
I'll do that for you, yes. So these dates that Litch gives, and what I've done is I've just given it in tabular form, but it's exactly as he writes it. So I've not adjusted any of his words, I've just reformatted it. He gives the 3 references here. What's his name? Yeah, let's go ahead and read it. So if you go and read the first paragraph.
That 10 kings did and can currently exist in the Western Roman Empire is a matter too notorious to be disputed.
Yep.
To be disputed, and too plain to need proof. The only difficulty in the way seems to be this: what 10 kingdoms are intended? For since their first establishment, they have continually been changing their names and location. Some have been plucked up or subverted, and others have arisen to take their place. This point, however, I think may be settled by the text, verses 7 and 8. And it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and beheld there came up among them another little horn, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. Observe first there were to be 10 kings contemporaneously flourishing, before any of the number were plucked up. And second, that 3 of the first 10 horns were to be plucked up by the roots before the little horn's establishment. The kingdoms must then be the first 10 established in Western Rome.
So Josiah Litch here is quoting from Daniel 7 when he reads verses 7 and 8. Then he gives 3 references. It says, according to, I think that's Machiavel, Bishop Lloyd, and Dr. Hale. So he gives 3 references, and those 3 references that he's given are on the chart right here when it says 490. And it says, division of Rome completed into 10 kingdoms, and then it says C, and he gives these three references: Machiavel, Bishop Lloyd, and Dr. Hale. So these three references are the ones that Josiah Litch is quoting here. So this information is identical to what you have on the chart. Then I've given you a reference from Apollos Hale, which gives the identical information. I've highlighted number 8, I've bolded that, because in the next box it's taken from Wikipedia, and it gives the date 476, because we use that quite often. And sometimes there's a bit of confusion why we use 476 and why the Millerites are using 490. So 476 this, if we could you go ahead and read it, Aaron?
By 476, when Odoacer deposed the Emperor Romulus, the Western Roman Emperor wielded
Negligible.
military, political, or financial power, and had no effective control over the scattered Western domains that could still be described as Roman.
Next paragraph.
Flavius Audiacer was a soldier who in 476 became the first king of Italy. His reign is commonly seen as marking the end of the Western Roman Empire.
So I've just given that for reference, because sometimes we get confused why we talk about 476, but on the chart it mentions 490. I've still not been able to locate the three references, the original source references, to see why they get 490, AD 490, because they're all in agreement that by 483, the 10th and the last horn is separated. So 483 seems to be a date that they all agree with, but they mark 490. So if anybody wants to take the time to look at those three references, if you can find them, to straighten those three things out. Now, when I used to teach Daniel 2, until recently, maybe like yourselves, I understood from the Spirit of Prophecy passage that I don't have the sheet for, but I've already given it to you, where she says that the iron and the clay are churchcraft and statecraft. I think she says it the other way around. Let's see if I've got it here. No, I won't read it. That the pioneer position is very clear that they looked at the iron and the clay as the weak and strong powers of Western Europe. And according to my understanding of how Ellen White was teaching these truths, I, in many ways, discounted the pioneer view of the feet and toes of iron and clay. Now, obviously, this has come up recently for various reasons. And so, when I've re-looked at this, where it says in Daniel chapter 2, we'll read verse 41. Just read verse 41. Who's next? Daniel 2, verse 41.
And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay.
So if we want to understand the pioneer position and integrate that with the Spirit Prophecy position, that it's churchcraft and statecraft, the way I'm understanding when it says in verse 41 that the kingdom is divided, is that this division is in two levels. So there's a division of the empire into nation states. But there's also a division between state. Sorry, these pens aren't working very well. And church. And I think we need to understand that those two divisions in many ways are happening concurrently. The other thing that I used to struggle with, maybe you did yourselves, is that when it speaks of the 10 toes, the pioneers are going to try and combine Daniel 7 with Revelation 17. They're going to try and combine those two chapters together. And in many ways, they were correct to do that, but the way they did it was obviously not quite correct, because they're trying to bring all of the world and try to shoehorn it into their own history. And we know that William Miller's understanding of the two desolating powers, paganism and papalism, as he was dealing with the 2520, was slightly incorrect. So do we know that? You know, he's going to go from 677 to 1844. But Hiram Edson? Yeah, Hiram Edson's going to go from 723 to 1798. And what's Hiram Edson going to do with that 2520? He's going to split it into two 1260s. And in these 1856 articles, he'll tell you that this view of the 2520 is incorrect. And the reason why he wants to tell you that they're incorrect is because he wants to develop this theme of the two desolating powers of 1260, because this is an established prophecy, 538, 1798. Because when William Miller develops his understanding of 2520 here, what he does is this. So if we draw this out as Hiram Edson understands, he's just going to do his 2520 like this, two 1260s. And if we start William Miller's 2520 like this, and it's going to go this way, the 40 years, 6 years out of sync, he's going to pick up this date, 538, and he's going to pick up this date, 1798, when he develops his logic about the 2520. So he's still going to pick up this 1260, and what he wants to do, because he's going to get to 1843, but I'm going to call it 1844, he's going to say that this is papalism, and this is paganism with this paganism. So he's going to combine this period of time with this period of time. And he actually calculates it to be 45 years because they're going to get to 1843. But if we put 46 years here, and we get 1260 and take 46 from it, we're going to get 1214 years. So what he does is he splits the pagan desolation into two portions, one at the beginning and then its completion at the end. And it's this pagan desolation, as someone said the 10 kings, I heard? Yeah, he's going to make this the 10 kings of Revelation 17. And combine that idea with Daniel chapter 7. So that's how William Miller is going to understand his 2520. So he takes all the thoughts and ideas that Hiram Edson works out and tries to shoehorn it into his understanding. So he's going to put 677 here to 1844. But he understands 723. So I don't know if we knew that. But the reason why I'm saying that is important is because when he looks at the 10 toes, he sees them interchangeably between Daniel 7 and Revelation 17. They're interchangeable concepts or ideas in his mind. And
Can you perhaps repeat that? What he did?
okay, so what he's doing is he understands, his primary argument is that when you go to Daniel chapter 8, you have the daily and you have the transgression of desolation. And this is paganism, and this is papalism. And what he's going to do, he's going to get this paganism and papalism, and he's going to still use this idea when he explains what the 2520 is, because he's going to say the 2520 is paganism and papalism, the daily and the transgression of desolation. But he's going to begin his 2520 in 677 for good reasons. We know that he was given the commencement of the chain of truth. Ellen White says that. And he says in his own memoirs that he has 3 dates that he uses to develop all of his understanding. And what were those 3 dates? 508.
677.
677 and 457. So he's going to focus his attention on this date here, and he's got 457, which is going to take him to 1843, and he's got 677, which is going to take him to 1843, and he's got 508, which is going to take him to 1843. So all of these 3 dates, they all take him to the same place. Now we know that because of the full year principle, he has a misunderstanding of these 2 prophecies because they should take you to the autumn of 1844, not the spring of 1844. So when he writes 1843 here, he really means 1844. We understand that, yeah? But he's focusing on the spring, not on the autumn. So his logic in developing his arguments, where he's focusing, that's why I put 1844, because when he writes 1843, it takes you to the spring of 1844. We're all okay on that idea of the full year principle and how that works, or not? Yeah? Okay, so he's taking those 3 prophecies and he's got all the argument he needs to write out, to plan out the 2520, 2300 days, and the 1335 right here. So this is the 1335, the 2300 days, 2520. But he still wants to overlay on top of that the 2 desolating powers. And what he's constrained to, he's constrained on 2 dates, 538 and 1798. So he's constrained on these 2 dates for the papal persecution or the transgression of desolation. And what he wants to do is demonstrate the pagan or daily desolation. And the way he does that, because he's going to go from 677, from Babylon, Medo Persia, and pagan Rome. So he tucks all of that history here, but he wants to take his prophecy to the end of the world. So here, he's going to be using the imagery of Daniel 7 and combine that with the 10 kings of Revelation 17. So he combines those 2 chapters together and explains that the 10 kings of Daniel 7, which are beginning in this time period, are going to be running all the way through, and then they continue for another 46 years to the end of the world in the guise of the 10 kings of Revelation 17. So when you think about it, it's actually quite a sophisticated way of doing things. It's, I think it's really good the way he worked that out. So when I used to understand Daniel 2, I used to say those 10 toes can't be the 10 horns of Daniel 7, because the 10 horns of Daniel 7, firstly, they're all formed, if we're going to go with the 490 date or by 538 you're into papalism, that by the time you get to from 490 to 538, when you're into the time period of papalism, there's only 7 horns anyway. So 3 of them have already been plucked up, so there wouldn't be 10 toes, there'd only be 7. So that's one argument. And in Daniel 2, verse 28, if someone can read just the, we'll read verse 28.
But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar that shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these.
So I used to argue that the latter days has to be dealing with the feet and toes, and the latter days must be the end of the world, so that those 10 toes can't be referring to the nations of Western Europe, that there was some mistake that the pioneers had made, for obvious reasons, because they want to complete everything by 1844, and that those 10 toes were really talking about the 10 kings of Revelation 17. I think differently now. I think both of those principles need to be tied in together and understood in a way that harmonises both views. But coming back to this division, the reason why I bring that thought up is when Ellen White talks about this division, she has a statement which she says it's iron and clay, but she has another statement that says it's basically the nations of the world which are in a divided and in a crumbling relationship. Remember that statement? That was from First Testimonies, page 16, I think? 316. So what I'm suggesting that the imagery of the feet and toes is trying to teach us is 2 things. It's trying to show us that there's a church and state relationship that's in existence, which is a division, but it's also trying to show us that division, that church and state relationship is going to be created over a matrix of 10. So these 10 toes become a symbol, even for the Millerites, even for the pioneers, because they know full well by 538 that there are only 7 kingdoms, but they still retain this concept of the number 10, I think, as a symbol. Whether they do that knowingly or not, I'm not sure, but they realise that there's only 7, but they want to take these 10 toes and make them a symbol of the division of the world into 10 segments, or even if they still focus upon Europe, they're still taking this number 10 and bringing it to the end of their world, which is how they can bring in Revelation 17. So the first thing...
Did I understand you correctly that you said the foot or the feet and the toes represent church and state?
I'm saying the iron and the clay
Okay.
represents churchcraft and statecraft, and you see that in the feet and you see that in the toes. So that's a symbology that's trying to be that the Lord is trying to show us. If this is a foot, there's iron and there's clay, which is state and church. But superimposed onto that, there's also this concept of the number 10. And the number 10 is only to do with a division of the empire or state. So both of those concepts are being combined together in this vision of the feet. But Ellen White also talks about the nature of this iron and clay, when they join together but don't cleave, produces this crumbling I don't have a copy of those notes. Does anybody have those two Spirit Prophecy quotes? I didn't think to print them out.
If anyone has
I
Jeff's notes.
I have the quote of William Miller here, where he describes this. Is it interesting idea?
I just want to read the one that Ellen White talks about it from First Testimonies.
If anyone has Jeff's notes, they're on like page 5 or something like that.
From yesterday or the day before.
From yesterday?
I think, what, the day before?
Can you come to the time?
Yeah. And the other one should be right below it, right?
Yep.
Okay.
What page you on?
Page 16.
Thank you. Well, actually, yeah, I've got it actually. Sorry. Testimonies, Volume 1, page 360, paragraph 3. Our kingdom is not of this world. We are waiting for our Lord from heaven to come to earth to put down all authority and power and set up his everlasting kingdom. Earthly powers are shaken. We need not and cannot expect a union among the nations of the earth. Our position in the image of Nebuchadnezzar is represented by the toes in a divided state and of a crumbling nature that will not hold together. Prophecy shows us that the great day of God is right upon us. So what Ellen White is doing, she's taking us into the toes, which gives us this symbol of the division of the empire of the world. So she's retaining that concept that the division is being identified by the number 10. And then she says, our position in the image of the Nebuchadnezzar is represented by the toes in a divided state and of a crumbling material. So this crumbling material that she's talking about is the combination of the iron and the clay. So she's still at one level retaining the pioneer understanding that this iron and clay can represent the inability of these nations to come together, but she wants to maintain it with the symbol of the number 10. So does anybody have any questions on that?
Sorry, where did you read that quote from?
Volume 1 of Testimonies, page 360.
Thank you.
So it's in the notes that I've given you and the ones that Elder Jeff has given in the past as well.
Parminder?
Yes.
Could you explain that please again? I don't see in this quote what you said in your last sentence.
So she says, our position in the image of Nebuchadnezzar is represented by the toes. So she says we're in the toes. So as soon as she says we're in the toes, then she's taking us back to this symbol of 10. So that's the first point that I'm making, that we're in this, there's a symbol of 10 that's being brought to view here by the fact that she's pointing us to the time period of the toes. And then she says we're in a divided state.
Yeah, it could be either the number 10 or it could be church and state.
So it can be either one of the two. So either we're saying this, that if it's divided, is the symbol of the 10 showing you 10 separate things? Is that what the division means? Or does the division mean that you've got, if I just do a box, that you've got pieces of iron in a matrix of clay which is crumbly? I think she's talking about this symbol, that the crumblingness is to do with the material, not with the number, not with the division is that it's divided in 10 separate things, that it's the material that is trying to show us that these nation states are in a divided situation. But she's bringing the point that there's a number 10 involved in this issue, but I don't think the 10 separate toes are what the division is being brought to view. It's the material that's indicating the division.
It says, there's two things that she says that help you to understand she says we're in the toes, and then she identifies, like you're saying, two characteristics of the toes. They're divided is one characteristic, and they're of a crumbling material. The crumbling material answers to the iron and clay, so the divided just has to answer to the fact that toes are divided. And that's the pioneer logic as well. I think that's what you're saying, is that there's two aspects here. She's saying it's divided because toes are divided, and of a crumbling material because these feet happen to be made of two different types of material that won't hold together.
So when you're saying the material that she's saying here, you're saying that's
Iron and clay.
church and state, or
Oh, I don't know. I'm just crumbling material. I'm not identifying. It's just crumbling material.
okay? Because I guess that's what part of Jonathan's question is. I'm assuming that what is she intend? What's her intention here?
Yeah, right.
Is she, what's the symbology of the division? Is it the symbology you've got 10 separate toes?
No, the division is 10 separate toes, and the crumbling material is the iron and the clay. When she says, the pioneers, if you're understanding that she's answering to what the pioneers are saying, when you read what the pioneers say, they say the fact that your toes are separate from each other identifies division. So when she's saying the toes in the divided state, she means that your toes are divided from each other. And then when she says of a crumbling material, that your toes are composed of iron and of clay. So when she says in a divided state, she's speaking directly to the fact that your toes are separate from one another. And then the crumbling material is answering to what you're saying with the iron and the clay, the iron mixed in a matrix of clay. So she means both things. She's answering to both of the pioneer understandings that the toes are divided and also they're made up of iron and of clay.
So the division of the world. So if we're getting into the world and it's been divided, and the division of the world is represented by the number 10. So we're going to put division by number 10. Then what does the material, its nature, what is that representing, the iron and the clay? Is that representing the fact that you've got church and state, which is in agreement with her other passage, or not?
Or weak and strong nations.
Yeah.
I kind of think it's both.
I've understood it to be both.
Yeah,
That's what I'm seeing, because in this last context in testimonies, it's specifically referring to that of the nation. It's not any mention of any church.
yeah, this from Testimonies Volume 1,
Right.
it seems to be more directly answering to that aspect where the nations won't hold together because they're weak. Because when she writes this, not all the nations were combined with the church necessarily. But you do have lots of nations not cleaving together for reasons outside of church-state combination.
So we know the pioneers have said that. So this is spirit of prophecy. And the pioneers say that iron and clay are strong and weak nations. So that's what the pioneers teach, and we have a spirit of prophecy quote that teaches us this, which seemed to be in contradiction. But this First Testimonies quote gives us the idea that we're in the time period of these toes, and there's 10 of them, and part of that symbol that's been shown here is, I'm just going to call it the number 10. And then she says that the material of these toes are of a crumbly nature. There's this iron and this clay mixed together. And the context of this whole paragraph is to do with the nation states. It's not to do with the church. So I think this statement here from the spirit of prophecy is in agreement with the pioneer position of the strong and weak nations. But if we combine that with the Spirit of Prophecy quote that it says it's churchcraft and statecraft, then it doesn't do despite to both of these statements, because we can still understand that the world is in the toes, symbolized by this number 10. So it's divided into 10 separate elements. On one level, it's this union of these 10 nations. At one level is of a crumbling nature. The strong and the weak nations are not really able to pull together. But it's also dealing with the fact that when you have these 10, that there's going to be a churchcraft and statecraft union at the end of the world. So that's how I'm understanding that passage. People look confused.
So 3 ways. There's three
ways.
explanations.
So what are the 3?
It's division of your toes, which is an empire type division. There's a church and state with the iron and clay type division. And then there's a weak and strong of the iron and clay. So there's 3 definitions
Yes.
of how it runs.
And that number 10 is initially over in this time period, a literal 10 nations, but they become symbolic by the time you get into this history, I shouldn't even point to here really. In this history here, they're literal. There are literal 10 nations of Western Europe, but by the time you get to the end of the world in Revelation 17, this division is going to be symbolized by this same number 10. So yes, there's those 3 things. The number 10 is showing you that there's a division of the world or the empire. At one level, it gives you a literal number, and at another level, it combines all the symbology that we understand about the United Nations, the 10 tribes of the northern part of Israel, that Egypt owns 10 states. All of those 10s teach us a lot. So that's one of those explanations. The nations that it controls, or that come together, not controls, that come together, are both strong and weak nations. We understand that. But also there's this union between church and state that's also going to be imprinted upon that in the same time period.
So that crumbling material we're saying is church and state.
The pioneers taught that the crumbling material was weak and strong nations. Ellen White says that they're church and state, and I think they're both correct. At one level they're church and state, and another level they're strong and weak nations. Both. Did anybody get, or bother looking at the iron and clay, did any study on it? Is there, in your mind, is there a resolution on that? Or not? Or is everybody just happy with what we spoke about before? The reason why I ask is, when I was over in Brazil, I was talking to 1 or 2 people, and they're still having issues that when it says potter's clay, they're going into the Spirit of Prophecy and into the Bible, picking up the term potter's clay, and still they're wanting to see that it's a representation of God's people. And God's people are not a representation of the papacy, and so they don't have resolution in their mind about that issue. So I don't know if we're still, if some of us are still struggling with that. Does that mean no or yes or? Okay.
Something completely off of this, but it has to do with division. But think about the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, they're split 4 and 6. And it, papacy has changed it. Basically, they've removed the 2nd commandment, and basically they've left it 3 and 6. But they've taken the 6 and they split it into 7.
So 3 and 7. I have no idea. Going back to the visions, the Hazon, the Mareh, and the Marah, And I know we still don't seem to have resolution on that, but before I even understood anything about the visions, the way I used to teach Daniel, the book of Daniel, was to do an introductory presentation which went something along these lines, that if we were looking at Daniel chapter 2, I would say that here is introduced the kingdom of Satan, and we can put Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece and Rome, the four kingdoms. And at the end you see a stone that's cut out of a mountain, and this is God's kingdom. So this is Satan, and this is God's kingdom. And then I'd go to Daniel 7, and I'd say that you see the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the iron beast, and then you'd see judgment. Then I'd go to Daniel chapter 8 and show the ram, the goat, and the little horn, and then the cleansing of the sanctuary. And then Daniel 11, which would basically show the king of the north. And it would go from Medo-Persia, Greece to Rome, and then you'd see the battle that's occurring in the glorious holy mountain. And the reason I teach it this way is for a number of reasons, because I wanted people to focus and understand what's going on in the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, and it's so easy to get tripped up because there's so many different views. There's views on what the glorious land is, whether it's a land or a church. There's Uriah Smith's view on this. And so I'd take people right back and show you that you've got 4 visions that are all teaching you the same story. How Satan's kingdoms are going to rise and bear rule over the earth, and how God is going to respond to this situation. So when the thoughts of these various visions began to be discussed, and we discussed it when I first came here, and there's still not full agreement on what those visions are. When we come to Daniel 8, because here you're going to see the Hazon vision and the Merer vision brought to view, even though you can still see the Hazon vision in chapter 7, that the way I've always understood chapter 8 is to have 2300 days from 457 to 1844, and then just right at the end you'd get the Merer vision, and this was the Hazon vision. And the reason I'd explain it this way, even if you were to take that from 1798 to 1844, and we've had some discussions on that it seemed to me that this model was the same model that you see in all of these chapters. They're always teaching things in that same way. So I think when we were speaking about the visions, I didn't perhaps make that as clear as I could have done. I don't know what the original source for this is. I've just got it as Faith I Live By. So I'll put the reference here. FLB 207, paragraph 1 to 6. This is a famous Ellen White passage that we're all familiar with, but I'm just going to read, I think I'm going to read paragraph 5. I think it's 5 that I've got here. The coming of Christ as our high priest to the most holy place for the cleansing of the sanctuary brought to view in Daniel 8:14. So here she's got 8:14. The coming of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days as presented in Daniel 7:13. So here's 7:13. And the coming of the Lord to his temple foretold by Malachi. So she introduces Malachi, but she doesn't give you the reference. But I'm just going to put it here. And it's Malachi 3:1. So here she's going to be talking about Malachi 3:1. Are descriptions of the same event, and this is also represented by the coming of the bridegroom to the marriage described by Christ in the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew 25. So here she's going to give Matthew 25. So she says, this, and this event are all the same event.
It's Great Controversy 426.
Thank you. Great Controversy?
426.
426. When I originally did my notes, I just got this one and I never went back in to put the original source.
Parminder, just for my notes, you're going to expand the rows to the left, to the right more? Or is it this?
No, that's it.
And quick question, what are we? So we've reviewed Daniel 2 now, and this is a new thing.
This is a continuation of Daniel 2, but I'm just giving an explanation because when we went to Daniel 2, what we did was we just looked at iron and clay when I did the presentation on iron and clay, and Elder Jeffs has done some presentations on Daniel 2, but it's still on kind of just an overall structure. But the reason why I'm bringing this issue up is it's connected to the issue of the clay, whether or not that clay can be something that was good or something that was bad. And what I'm doing is I'm not just saying let's look at the wording of Daniel 2, which is what I did last time, but say let's step back and look at the structure of all of these chapters because they all are saying the same thing. And in connection with that, I think the issue of the various visions comes into play. So I'm trying to deal with the issue of the visions and connect them to this study of Daniel 2. We all know why we're looking at Daniel 2, don't we? Mm-hmm. Yeah? We're looking at Daniel 2, maybe, I don't know, you're smiling. Why are we looking at Daniel 2 for?
Because Michael.
Yeah. Michael.
Michael had his study on it or something like that, and it was being controverted somewhere.
Ezekiel 21.
Ezekiel 21 with the Daniel 2.
Okay, yeah, so that's
repetition.
So that's the reason why we're looking at this. Tiffany.
No, I was going to say Ezekiel 21.
Okay. The reason why I'm interested in carrying and looking at this is because when I first came here, I went to Eatonville before I came to School of Prophets, and I asked them if I could do some presentations, and I wanted to do Daniel chapter 8 and Revelation 17, and they wanted to do some other studies, so we never actually ended up getting to Revelation. And so I'm interested now that we've gone full circle and we're all looking at Revelation 17. But the reason we're looking at Revelation 17 is to buttress our understanding of Daniel 2. So it's still going into Daniel 2. So there's some things that we haven't discussed in Daniel 2 that I want to look at, review, and discuss. So the first thing I wanted to do is, where I normally would go, would to show the relationship between the statue, or Satan's kingdom, and God's kingdom. And that's how I'm understanding these 4 chapters. And that's what's given me whether it's incorrect or not, the structure of the Hazon vision and the Moreh vision. And from my memory, I think this is how the relationship between these two visions were taught for many, many years. That's my recollection of it. And I think the term people would use would be a snapshot vision. This was the snapshot, and this was the complete. I think people would say it was complete and the snapshot.
If you would make an extra column for Revelation 17, how would it look like? I mean, Satan's kingdom and God's kingdom from Revelation 17.
You can do that, but it's.
Is that possible?
I think it is, but I think in Revelation 17 you see that the 10 kings come and do that work. I think you can do it in Revelation 17. I haven't thought it through well enough, so I just added these two because I was just looking at the book of Daniel because Ellen White references these two with that.
Because but it lines up all the same kingdoms. I mean, it's
The book of Revelation and Daniel, they should all line up in the same way, but Daniel is really easy to see for me. It's really easy to see this imagery as you go through. So that's what I'm saying about these two visions. And if that's correct, then this, the stone, the judgment, the sanctuary, the glorious holy mountain, are all representations of the Moreh vision. And today we don't use the complete vision or the snapshot. We don't use that phraseology. We use a different phraseology now. And the phraseology that I think we're using, that I use, is to see that this is prophetic history. This is the vision of prophetic history, and this is, I still like to use the idea that this is God's response to prophetic history. But when we see that, one of the things that I'm understanding is that prophetic history, I used to teach that prophetic history will take you into the most holy place. Just the study of this will bring you to this point here. And I think that's correct. But if we understood this, if I were just to put a 1, 2, and a 3 here, representing the everlasting gospel, that when we get to the third step, we're into the most holy place. We're meeting Christ here. What that shows me is that this Hazon vision is actually the mechanism or the vehicle or the tool that God is going to use to purify us and make us right. And here our character is demonstrated. So before I used to think that I used to be interested in studying the 2300 days or all these prophecies, but I just thought it was a theoretical or an intellectual study of these things, and somehow or another, by magic, if you like, it would take you to here, and when you get to here, then you'd be cleansed. Something would happen to you. But I don't think that's correct. It's a study of the Hazon vision. This vision of prophetic history is what changes your character. And here is where it's demonstrated.
Brother Parminder, I just out of curiosity, have you ever looked in the whole book of Daniel where you found the word Hazon, whether it's in Aramaic or in Hebrew? Because you find it in Daniel chapter 2 also, actually verse 28 where we just read, that word vision is actually the word Hazon.
Yes. There's very little difference between the Aramaic and...
Actually, they're linked up together.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just wondering, did you take a look at that just in the book of Daniel where you find the word Hazon?
I haven't done it comprehensively enough, and I think it would be a worthwhile exercise to do because it would teach us much more about these things than we already know.
I think it might expand the view on the Hazon vision because it's not, in English, or not in English, but in Daniel chapter 8, it specifically talks about two distinctions.
Mm-hmm.
But in the other ones, they're also expressed. But I think that if we're going to come to a conclusion with the Hazon vision, I think that the whole book of Daniel should be searched out on that particular item.
I agree with you. But I don't think we're going to be able to do that in class because we're kind of headed in another direction. But if this is correct, and I think that it is. You've got 4 chapters that show you an identical structure, and this is correct also, that then all of these 4 representations are a representation of the Moray vision, and that then these would be a representation of the Hazon vision, or the vision of prophetic history.
How did you prove that?
How did we prove what?
That all of God's kingdom is the Moray vision, and all of the...
From Daniel chapter 8. This is where we're going back to how I explained Daniel chapter 8, and how I think it's been explained for a while, for many years, right from the beginning, which is different to how some people are understanding chapter 8 at the moment. I know there are some brethren who see it different. They see that the Hazon is the 2520, and the 2300 days is the Moray vision. So I'm not going to rehash that now, but it's to show you from Daniel 8. This is how I understand that structure. I think that's how it's been taught for a long while, and I still don't fully understand how it's being portrayed in another way. And the other way is this: the 2300 days and the 2520, and this is the Moray vision, and this is the Hazon vision. I understand some of the logic, and I don't have any problems making the 2520 the Hazon the Hazon vision. I agree with that, but I think the Hazon vision is any kind of history. It doesn't just have to be these long prophetic histories. It can be even a short story about the book of Esther. That's how I understand the Hazon vision, and it always brings you to this point of how God is going to deal with this history, or this event, or this dynamic.
So would that be then consistent then that whenever we're taking a look at Satan's kingdom, that we're taking a look more at the Hazon vision?
Yes, but we have to be careful in some of the stories, because if you're going to say Satan's kingdom, it's how the enemy is interacting either in its own sphere of influence, so how empires take one after another. But here, when we come to the little horn, if this is correct, then this is still part of the Hazon vision, but now this is how, not only how it's going to rise to its to supremacy, but it's also showing you what it does with God's people and how it interacts with God's people. So in the book of Esther, a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing there is how the world wants to come and destroy God's people. So that is still part of that vision. You can still see it. You can definitely see it in chapter 8. You can see it in Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, that many shall be overthrown. So it's not exclusively just what the nations of the world are doing by themselves. They can interact with God's people depending on what those individual stories are teaching us. But the separation between the Hazon and the Moray is how God is going to come back and respond to this issue, how he deals with it. And it always happens at the end. Yes, basically that's what it is. This was my primary logic to say that the clay in Daniel chapter 2 cannot be related to God's people, because this is dealing with the rise and fall, or the setting up of Satan's kingdom, and this is how God's going to deal with it. And I don't get troubled by trying to take history and dovetail it into Daniel chapter 2. I'm just taking it at a really simple level, that when it talks about iron and clay, it's talking about either the relationship between church and state, or the relationship between strong nations and weak nations. So when we take Daniel chapter 2 and we have iron and clay, I see that as the same, that when you go to Daniel 7, where would we see it in Daniel 7? What would we see in Daniel 7 that would show us this church-state relationship? Let's turn to Daniel 7 and for me, it's verse 8. So whoever's next, can they read verse 8? I'll tell you what I think, and maybe we've got a different opinion.
Okay. Verse 8 it says, "And I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things."
Verse 24 of this chapter is the interpretation or the explanation of verse 8. So let's read verse 24.
And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings.
So the 2 phrases that I'm picking up from verse 8, it says, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up. So I'm picking up this phrase, before whom. So the way I understand before whom is that you have these 10 horns that are standing up, then this little horn comes up and he stands before them and he commands that 3 of those horns are plucked up. That's how I understand when it says before whom. In front of his presence, in his presence, 3 horns are going to be plucked up. And it gives the connotation that it's at his behest that this is happening. Then verse 24 confirms this. It says, "And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings." So verse 24 says the little horn does the subduing, and verse 8 says before him they are plucked up. And so here, this is where I'm identifying churchcraft and statecraft. The church and the state are joining here in verse 8 when it uses the word before whom, and then in verse 24 it says he shall subdue. So is there any comments on that?
Praise the Lord, because I used to interpret that before as in it was the papacy was sort of, then if we had to get plucked up before, as in before the papacy can come in that context and not in front of.
Okay, so that's an important principle to understand, yeah?
You can understand it just by it says, there came up among them another little horn. So he's there with all 10 at the beginning, and then he works to destroy 3.
And if we got into the details of Daniel 2, I think it's important to understand that, to dovetail that history.
And so now why was it that we're going to this here verse, the reason why we're taking a look at this?
Just looking at, what I've said is this, when you develop this structure, there are people who are still not happy that the potter's clay, the phrase potter's clay in Daniel 2 is representing the enemies of God. They still see that in that phrase some kind of symbology about God's people, because they pick up the phrase potter's clay, and Ellen White will use that phrase, and you can find it in scriptures as well, and they develop an argument to say that it's still good clay. As soon as you start doing that, then you have to start explaining the prophetic understanding of how you're going to deal with the feet and toes, how you're going to go from good to bad. So my position is that it's always bad. So we did a word study on that to show that, and that word study is based upon an understanding when it says potter's clay, it really means a potter's vessel, and that potter's vessel opens up our understanding that it's not a vessel that is a container, it's a vessel that's been broken, and in its broken state it cannot bind or cleave with the clay. So those 2 ideas are totally opposite. They stand in opposition to one another. that it's always bad or it goes from good to bad. So what I'm showing you, one of the primary arguments that I use besides a word study on it is the structure of the chapter itself, and then you go through all of these other 3 chapters and they all follow the same structure. So if they all follow the same structure, if we were to go to Daniel chapter 8, I don't think you'd find God's church in Daniel chapter 8 in the ram, the goat or the little horn. You don't see it, there's no imagery for that. And I don't think you can find it in Daniel 11. And you certainly can't find it in Daniel 7. But suddenly, we want to bring it into Daniel 2. Because here in Daniel 2, what we want to do is, we want to bring God's church into the story, into this statue. And if you do that, it stands in opposition to these 3 chapters. So that's the primary argument that the clay cannot represent God's kingdom.
That's the judgment, cleansing of the sanctuary, glory of the mountain. That's not.
I'm bringing it in this portion, in Satan's, because it's in the statue. Yeah. So when you go to, so here we have iron and clay. So we're okay with that. We have iron and clay, and I'm saying this is state and church. And here you can definitely see state and church, both historically and in symbology. And when you go to Daniel chapter 8, the clearest passage for me that deals with that is verse 12. Daniel 8 verse 12. Because we'll read Daniel 8 verse 12.
Oh, sorry, yeah. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth of the ground, and it practiced and prospered.
I want to go through Daniel 8, 11 and 12. Just a brief review, not today, but in another study, in another class, to look at this daily and what happens to it. Because I don't know if we're all in agreement or we have the same understanding exactly about there's just a small technical bits in there.
Can I read it the way it should have been?
Before you do that, let me just finish what I'm saying. Because I watched one of the studies while I was away, and I think people may have a misunderstanding or a misconception of what I'm saying, because I only breezed over some of these verses, and people might have a misconception of what they think that I've said or what my position is on some of these things. So I wanted to just make sure that we're all on the same page. Sister Tanya.
Oh, okay. And a host was given her against the daily paganism by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and she practiced and prospered.
So is that your interpretation of that?
That from the studies that we've done.
Yes. So read that again, and so read that again so that everybody realises that these are your words, and see if we all agree with that.
Oh. And a host was given her, papacy, against the daily paganism by reason of transgression, and she cast down the truth to the ground, and she practiced and prospered.
So I agree with that statement. I don't know if anybody disagrees. I think there's...
If you're going to change the words, at least change against to what?
What did you...
From, right?
Yeah, I have that too. I didn't
I
see
mean, if
it.
you're going to modify, let's modify.
That's right.
Okay, let's deal with this word against then in a second. Brother Marco.
Brother Tyler did just the other day a presentation also on this issue, and I think he resumed it pretty in a simple way, that we see the toe in the foot a mingling. Whatever it is, that it's always mingled. And just from this perspective, it can never be good.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, I mean, it's just mingled, and it's never
Whether it's wet
mingled.
or
It's
dry
a,
or anything, it's just mingled always.
And that's part of my logic to say that when you get to Daniel 8, here you see a church and a state coming together. It says a host was given to the papacy. So right here we see I'll just put state and church. So this is in the terminology of a host was given him, but it actually should be her. And then it says, by reason of transgression. So what we say in this word against is, because this comes up in 11:14, isn't it?
11:24.
11:24, that's it. What we say in the against means. So a host was given him,
Her.
was given her, okay, her,
From
from paganism.
by reason of transgression.
Okay, so I'm understanding this verse slightly differently. Let me show you how I understand this verse and see if you're okay with that. Let's read 11:24.
It says, He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds even for a time.
So here's the word against.
Devices from the stronghold.
It's been a while since I've looked at the original. What does the original actually say?
The definition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're in.
Above, according, after, against, among.
So let's go, because I don't think that's what my recollection is. I don't think against actually means from.
In 25, it has that same word, using from at the very bottom. They shall forecast devices from, so you've got that from represented as against.
So
You don't agree.
So this is how I'm understanding it. Against means on top of. And in its original sense, I think it means on top of, in the sense of a fight. So let me separate this portion here. And when I've understood against means that you're fighting with somebody, and so you're against them. So this is why they use the word against, because it comes from this concept that you're in a fight and you're fighting with somebody. But when you're fighting with somebody, if you think about the imagery of wrestling with someone, there are two people who are wrestling and one's on top of the other. So one who's on top of the other is winning the fight. And so from the sense of a fight, then it gives you the ability to see that it actually can represent being on top of something.
Because the definition says above, over, upon, or against, yet always in the last relation with a downward aspect. So
Yes.
when it's used in against, it's always in a downward, above
Pushing.
aspect.
So this is where you get this concept of a fight. You're pushing or fighting against something. But it talks about that you're on top of. So if we take that definition here, it says on top of, in the sense that something is beneath you.
Where did you guys get that definition?
It's the strong.
So
Strong.
there's something beneath you or on top of something. So in 11:24, when it says he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, I understand that verse to say, you could read it from his strongholds, but I think it's actually portraying that he's going to be standing on top of his strongholds. So I've always imagined that if you've got a castle like this, here's our castle, and he is standing here, and he's forecasting his devices on top of his castle, or his city, or his wherever we're going to define his fortress is, the place of his sanctuary, that he's doing it while he's standing on top of it. So when we go through 11:24, when we say from his strongholds, it gives you the same answer, because he's going to do it from the city of Rome. But I think the imagery is he's actually saying he's going to be sitting in an authoritative place. When I'm sitting in the city of Rome and I forecast my devices, it's going to be with strength. then when he leaves Rome, it's not going to be with strength. So it gives you the same answer in 11:24, but in 8:12 it gives you a slightly different answer.
I'm going to say, probably need to check which lexicon the pioneers were using, because I've seen different ones, different translations. And I was going through the 2520, for instance, and I was looking at the whole 7 times and what was there. What I began to find out was these Strongs and all these different things, they're actually interpretations. I used to think it was a word for word exact thing, but it's actually not. It's actually James Strong's interpretation of what he thinks the word should be. But if you go to a different one, you probably find there's potential and you're finding a different meaning to the word.
Of course, James Strong, though, when he's doing this, he's comparing where it's found everywhere in the Bible and then making his understanding of the word based upon how it's used always. So like if you went to Daniel 11:25 and you read it from, it doesn't make sense. And it's used twice in Daniel.
I'm not saying.
No,
I'm just putting that into the.
So the point that you're making is that, and I think we all understand this. You know, if you speak a foreign language, or you speak English, if you want to go from one language to another, and someone says, "What does that word mean?" You know, 3 people will give a slightly different connotation of what it means, but they'll all be saying that, you know, around the same kind of thing. And the more you know the language, the better explanation you can give. And they all have these different nuances. That's why you have 3 or 4 different definitions, plus you have 3 or 4 different King James, in the King James Bible, 3 or 4 different words that are used for that. So, you know, when you do Strong's, I think everybody should know that it has a number, then it has a definition, then it has a colon with a dash after it, then it has a number of words. These are not the definition of the word when you're looking in Strong's. This portion here is the definition. These are the words that the King James translators chose to use based upon this definition. And sometimes when we say, "Oh, this word means this," we include this as if this is a proof of what it means. But this is not a proof of what this Hebrew word means. Yeah. This would just be someone's interpretation of what this definition means.
But it is used in the Bible.
These are the words that they chose to use, but they're not. If you're choosing to use these words, that doesn't qualify as a definition of what the word means. So that's the definition, and that's what they chose to use. We need to know that because it gives us an insight. But sometimes we say, "Oh, this means this, this, and this," and see, it means this, and it proves what we're saying is correct. But these 3 at the back end don't prove anything. They just say that what the King James, which is what the translators chose to use. Someone had their hand up.
Yeah, I'm okay with Daniel 11:24 and 25 on top of.
Okay.
But it makes a difference than in Daniel 8:12.
Yeah, so let's have a look at Daniel 8:12. So this is how I've understood 12. So this is part of the discussion, or part of the reason why I wanted to look at these things, because when you study by yourself for any length of time, you get out of sync with everybody. And part of the exercises of Daniel 2 is we're all trying to get back into sync together, so we don't have varying views. So I'm understanding verse 12 this way. And a host. So there's a host. The first thing I want to point out is that when it says the daily, the word daily in the book of Daniel happens how many times? How many times do you see that?
4 or 5.
We should really know it's 5 times. It's 5 times in the book of Daniel. And how many times is it in the whole Bible? 104. I'm pretty sure it's 104. It's 104 times in the Bible. Check if I'm right. So every time we come to the daily in the book of Daniel, the 5 times, what my contention is this: it's okay. At one level, it always means paganism. It always means paganism, and that's okay. But each of those verses is dealing with a specific history. So if we were going to say in the book of Daniel, the daily means paganism, then we'd all say we're all in agreement. We're all on the same page. But when we start looking at the details of those verses, that's where we start to sort of have a disagreement or different opinions. And so I'm suggesting that each time you go to the book, each time you go to those 5 verses, it's going to give you a slightly different history, and the slightly different history is going to give you a slightly different interpretation of what it means. So and therefore the daily itself would have a slightly different definition. It's always going to end up as paganism at a foundational level, but historically it will mean something different. So this is how I understand this verse. The host, I've understood it to be Clovis. And so I'm reading this. Clovis was given to the papacy. And the reason he's given to the papacy, so I've got the word against, which means to be on top of or to fight. So the host, Clovis, is given to the papacy to make war or to fight against the daily. So I'm gonna have to put the word against just to make the sentence flow, but I'm not using against in that definition. So he's going to be on top of, I'll just leave it there, on top of the daily. And the historical connection between that is that I'm seeing that this is the Visigoths in 508. We could put 507, 508. So that's how I'm reading the historical portion of the first part of that verse, is that Clovis is given to the papacy to fight the Visigoths. Now, I don't know if when we say that in verse 12, to read it the other way, it says, a host was given to the papacy from paganism, from the 10 tribes. So, at one level, we could say it's just a moot point. It's virtually the same, but I don't know. When you see it that meaning from, do you see that the host is Clovis, or?
But Clovis was once a time he was pagan.
Yes.
But he converted.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say that against. It could be mean both.
So I'm just explaining how I understand the word against, because then we say, if we're saying this, we're saying Clovis was given to the papacy from pagan Rome or 10 pagan tribes. We change the definition of what the daily is. And I'm not saying that if we're going to read the verse that way, it's correct. That's what actually happens in real life. You have paganism, and from paganism, Clovis is going to be selected. So that's a correct historical application. But I've understood that the daily is actually the Visigoths. It's a historical event that happened. And once that happens, then the second part of the verse kicks in, I guess. And it casts down the truth to the ground, and it practices and prospers. So it's not the reason I did that, but that's how I've understood it. But it gives you the ability to put a date into that verse. So the other way you'd do it is you'd say a host was selected from them, and you'd put 496 in that verse. So I guess you'd say the first part of verse 12 is 496, and I'm saying the first part of the verse is 508. So I don't know if that makes any material difference to you or not.
Why just the Visigoths and not all three of the pagan?
Because Clovis doesn't do anything. Yeah.
Those are the areas.
So that's another reason that Clovis only does, at one level, he only does one job for the papacy. He takes down the Visigoths, which it's like a domino effect. Once that happens, everything collapses after it. But it's the Byzantine Empire that takes the three horns down. Clovis doesn't do that. So it's all based upon how we're going to read the word against. I think the word against means to have a fight with somebody. And when you develop that thought about having a fight, it gives you the idea that you're being on top of something with something beneath you. You're pushing something down, which is the imagery that's given in 11:24. And I'm using that same imagery in verse 12.
I just wanted to add on to that, on top of, or like the overseer. Another name for Vatican is the sees of Rome, or you
The
know,
Holy
there's
See.
the Holy See, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
which goes exactly what you're saying. The overseer, he sees everything from Rome. He's on top of everything.
It also gives the same connotation of being on top of that you see in Revelation, where the woman's on top of the beast or on top of
Yeah.
the seven hills.
Yeah.
So it's
Holy
always
See doesn't
that same.
refer to sea.
Yeah, it does not.
So I don't think they picked that up, Gabriel, brother. Can you?
The Holy See does
I don't
See
think they
doesn't
pick-
come from
Oh.
seeing. It comes
Yes.
from seat, Latin.
Oh, okay.
What you're saying, you're on top of
Yeah.
the seat. You're on
When you
throne.
look at it,
So
Still
the sea comes from not looking; it comes from
Sedis.
sitting,
Yeah.
and you're sitting in a position of authority, overlooking.
yeah, you're still kind of doing the same
Yeah.
thing.
I still have a problem with. Oh, what means problems? But how do you say? Why do you say? I understand why you say the daily is the Visigoth, but I think in verse 13 in the whole chapter it talks more on a common, in more a common way. You say now very specific. It's exactly that, but I would say Daniel 8 is more. Shows more progression, you know, of the daily, and how the papacy overthrow the daily. Do you see my point?
More generally saying.
It's more
So you want to make
general
verse 12
sense.
kind of a more general.
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, if you say in verse 12 the daily is specific the Visigoth, in verse 13 you have to make it more general again. You know what I mean? So you have to change the meanings of the Daniel. Sometimes it's more specific, sometimes it's more generally. You see what I mean?
But I think that's correct, because if you're going to go to Daniel 12 verse 11, and it says take away the daily, and you compare, so Daniel 12:11 it says take away the daily,
Yeah.
and then 8:11 where it says take away the daily, you have to understand the daily differently in both of those verses, because the take away is different. They're totally different takes away. The taking away is different. So if it's a different time than for taking away, you'd have to try. You have to understand how you're relating to what that daily is that's being dealt with in both of those verses. I don't think it can be addressed as you're saying they're the same thing. You can just say paganism. That's fine to say. In 8:11 it says paganism is taken away, and you can say in 12:11 paganism is taken away. But when you try and nail down what those historical events are happening, in 12:11 you're going to make that 508. The daily is taken away in 508 with 30 years preparation, so that by the time you get to 538, now it's placed. So this, in the English, I think it could have been translated slightly differently, but it says take away the daily in 508 so that it's set up by 538. But you can't use that, and if you're going to do that, then in 12:11, what event are you marking? You're marking the Visigoths for sure in 12:11, but you can't use that same. So you're not saying paganism in some kind of generic, general sense. You're using a very specific history, but you can't use that same daily back in chapter 8, verse 11, because that daily is something that's totally different. So I agree with you when you say in verse 12 that you can make it in a kind of a generic sense. But what I've marked is that verse 12, it's split into two parts. First, he does a work in this church-state relationship, and then he's going to cast the truth down to the ground, and he's going to practice and prosper. After this thing, something has to happen for him to be able to do his activities. And I've marked that at 508 based upon what happens in 12:11. We've run out of time. I know we've got some questions. We'll pick this up again tomorrow. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your loving kindness and your goodness towards us. We ask and pray that you would be with us, that you would bless us. Direct our thoughts to the most holy place, Lord, where you're there ministering on our behalf. May we honour and glorify you in all that we do and all that we say. May you be with us and protect us this day. We ask all these blessings in the name of Jesus. Amen.